David Schweickart is a professor in philosophy at Loyola University in Chicago, and you hold PhDs in mathematics and in philosophy. We leftists, we are against capitalism, but few of us know what we want instead. And you're a leader in thinking outside the capitalist box. Most notably, you've written this classic, After Capitalism. And we're most thrilled to have you here.
Wait, thank you very much. Actually, it's thrilling to be here. I've only been in Sweden once before. Can you? Okay, I think it's on. Okay, we'll hope it's on. Okay. But anyway, I've got a paper. This question of alternatives to capitalism is something I have been thinking about my entire academic life since I switched from being a mathematician to a philosopher, because I read Capital, and that turned my world upside down. I became persuaded at that point that there's something fundamentally wrong with capitalism. But then the question was, what is the alternative? And at the time I was becoming a Marxist in a way, it was clear that the Soviet model was flawed. At first I thought, well, maybe it's just not democratic, but the more I looked into it, the more I became persuaded that no, there's some fundamental structural problems with trying to plan rationally an entire economy. So my project from the time I was a graduate student on has been to articulate, see what other people are saying about a viable alternative to capitalism. And the latest version of that is in my book, After Capitalism. I wrote a book 9 years before that called Against Capitalism, right at the time when communism had collapsed and everyone was giving up on the left. And my sense was, well, they may have all the power, but it is not true when they say there is no alternative. There is, we can imagine a viable alternative. And so that's what I want to talk about today. Now, I apologize a little bit for the paper. The paper I've given versions of this in a lot of different settings, most recently in Gothenburg on Wednesday at an international sociology conference, but it was a much condensed version of that. I've given it a number of times in the United States. And so it's most what I'm thinking about and drawing on when I'm talking about the economic crisis, which is what I'm going to spend some time talking about. I'm talking about it as it developed and unfolded in the United States. So it's going to be different here, but I think it's crucial to understand what happened over there and how we could think about an economic system that is not vulnerable to certain kinds of crises. So we've got what I call these deep irrationalities of global capitalism. On the one hand, you've got this ever-growing inequality, and it is just getting worse and worse. And it's paper wealth, is $900 million of a hedge fund operator that God knows what he did, and this soul-destroying poverty. I mean, poverty is just so destructive. Another crisis. We've got more control over nature, contradiction, than ever before, and yet more and more ecological devastation. This is rooted in, I'll talk more about this later, but this row or die expansionary dynamic of capitalism, and most recently we're seeing it in the Gulf of Mexico. Drill, baby, drill. That was Sarah Palin's slogan, that, we've got to have more oil. We've got to, well, we're running up against some serious problems here. And another one is a technology that could give everyone more leisure. I mean, technology that is labor saving, right? That means we could, instead of giving everybody more leisure, it's throwing millions and hundreds of millions of people out of work, and those that still have work are finding themselves having to work harder than ever, longer hours than ever. There's something irrational about that, okay? So my sense is, and it's been for a long time, we need a new economic system. And I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to call it economic democracy. Now, that is going to be called socialism. and for good reason. It is a form of socialism. But can you use that language? Now here I'm thinking of an American audience, and here's one of our most important progressive economists, Paul Krugman, who in a recent book just published a year ago, who now can use the words of socialism with a straight face. As a member of the baby boomer generation, I can remember when the idea of revolution, of brave men pushing history forward, had a certain glamour. Now it is a sick joke. The truth is that the heart has gone out of the opposition to capitalism, says Krugman. But curiously enough, on the very next paragraph in that book, capitalism is secure not only because of its successes, which have been very real, but because no one has a plausible alternative. This situation will not last forever. Surely there will be other ideologies, other dreams, and they will emerge sooner rather than later if the current economic crisis persists and deepens. Well, I'm going to argue that the current economic crisis is going to persist and deepen. In fact, it's not just one crisis. We've actually got more than one. And I'm going to talk first about the economic crisis. Basically, we've got two big crises facing us right now. One is an economic crisis. The other is an environmental crisis. I'm going to talk about how they're linked. But let me run through, the economic crisis as it unfolded in the United States. Now, there may be variations on how it all worked out here in Europe, but it's a global crisis. But I want to say, you may have heard about all the corruption. I want to say, well, forget about that. That's not the real story. Forget about unscrupulous mortgage brokers passing off, talking people into mortgages that they couldn't understand and couldn't afford. Forget about the corrupt rating agencies that were giving these triple A ratings to these various kinds of concocted securities. Forget about the lax regulations. Forget about investment banks concocting collateralized debt obligations that they knew weren't any good and then betting against them using credit default swaps. I mean, there's this whole complicated story of corruption, but that's not the real story, okay? And also, I would say, even set aside the financial sector altogether. Now, the standard story of the U.S. financial meltdown goes something like this. We had a housing bubble, okay? As a result of that, the new financial instruments were invented, in particular mortgage-backed securities. Securities, those values were based on the value of these mortgages, but when the housing bubble popped, when housing prices stopped going up, all of a sudden we had a meltdown in the mortgage-backed securities. Now, roughly what a mortgage-backed security is, for those of you that aren't familiar with this, mortgages, home mortgages. In the good old days, you wanted to buy a house, you went to a savings and loan association, you went to a bank, the bank checked your credit rating and made you a loan, and then you paid that money back to the bank, right, over time. Well, Wall Street had a new idea. Because housing prices were going up, everyone wanted to kind of get in on this somehow. So banks were selling their mortgages to investment banks. So you didn't have to worry anymore about whether the person you loaned the money to, could repay it or whatever. You just took the bank, sold it. Mortgage banks, investment banks would collect huge pools of these. You'd have, say, 1,000 mortgages. So this means every month there's 1,000 payments coming into this big pool. Okay, yes, question? A mortgage is just a loan. Yeah, we call it a home loan. In the U.S., those are called mortgages. That's all it is, okay? Fixed rate or adjustable rate, there's various versions of that, but yeah, just a loan. So you've got all these loans coming in, and then they would slice this big pot up into pieces called tranches. New word was invented, okay? The safest ones were in the first tranche, and then the more risky ones in the second, and then the more risky ones. So you had these various tranches that were themselves chopped up, and then you sold those off to whoever wanted to buy them. Other banks wanted to buy them, other countries wanted to buy them, pension funds